Today on Unbiased, we're exploring identity and achievement. And I'm exploring this with a really remarkable guest who's joining me from London today, Bilal Mahmood. And Bilal is Senior Counsel and Global Lead at RBC, the Royal Bank of Canada, in their Wealth Management Division. And he was recently named RBC's Global Champion of the Year 2024 for his work raising awareness around Ramadan and empowering disadvantaged youth to access the financial and legal sectors. He's also, even more recently, accepted an invitation to be the first convener of the City Muslim Network, fostering allyship and connection across London's financial hub. Now, over his 15-year legal career, Bilal has built a leading international corporate finance practice, spanning the world's top-tier law firms and senior in-house roles, including as head of legal at China Construction Bank. Now, beyond his legal expertise, Bilal is a tireless advocate for social mobility and youth development, setting up and leading debate mentoring programs that have inspired thousands of young Londoners over 2 decades. And he's also a board member at the Future Governance Forum, which is a progressive think tank focused on reforming how the system of government delivers, tackling everything from power transfers to mission-led governance and stimulating public-private investment. And Bilal has a vested interest in how a government delivers because on top of being a lawyer, an advocate, a mentor, and a youth community builder, he's also stood as parliamentary candidate for the Labour Party in London. And he's contributed heavily to previous political campaigns, including that of the election of Sadiq Khan as mayor. Bilal, it's such an honor to have you here with us. Welcome to Unbiased.
Thank you for having me. And when you rolled out my intro, I was almost getting tired of hearing from it. There's a lot. And it's only when someone else kind of presents it back to you, you're like, gosh, that's a mouthful. So thank you for that.
Well, it's my pleasure, but also it really kind of stimulated this theme of identity and achievement. Because while I first want you to share with us, Bilal, that, given that the depth and the breadth of all of your experience and achievements to date is indeed a lot to get your head around. Tell me, what are you trying to prove by doing so much at such an elite level, all at the same time?
Yeah, it's everything all at once. I guess you start with, you don't know what you don't know when you start doing this stuff. Mm-hmm. So when I was growing up, my mum and dad worked very, very hard. It was working class background. Mum had maybe 2 jobs on the go at one time. Dad had to travel a lot for his work. So I never really saw them do anything but work. And so that's your precept. We really didn't take many holidays. We weren't really engaged in kind of formal civic society. So for me, that kind of drive of like, well, you just keep pushing is just the default. So I think that was the first thing is that. And then also just watching them work very, very hard, but not necessarily benefit from society as much as you probably think they would have done if they were working, if it were other people who weren't immigrants, for example. And from that, you develop a sense of imposter syndrome. Many people do, I think, from minority backgrounds who are in the professional services, particularly as they scale up. And I think that you always have this subconscious feeling where the way to describe it is you're almost going to get one shot at things. So when you want to introduce yourself to somebody with a mover and a shaker, a power thing, I almost fumble over my words because to try and articulate and encapsulate what you very, very kindly set out in a 2-second elevator pitch, it's really, really hard.
So at this stage, 15 years into your professional career, at whatever some 30s, 40s age you must be now, has that started to dissipate? Or is that continuing? Is that kind of that imposter syndrome that will there be more that I need to keep saying? Is there almost a scarcity mindset at play here that feels like it will continue to fuel you going forward?
Yes, it is dissipating, actually, but that requires work. that you would think all the things that you do would be enough to dissipate it. It doesn't. It's almost like an addiction or a hole that never solves it. You do need to do the work to come to terms with a lot of the struggles that you'll face are not really your own doing. It's just the context of systemic inequality or life, all those things. So but that's because I've had to kind of do the work myself to come to terms with things. I also now, conversely, lean into a bit more saying, well, actually, I should be doing this or I should be doing that. And I think very often you'll say yes. People often say yes to everything. And there's a strength, I think, in a power in saying no to things. And I am much better now at turning things down that distract me from the things that I like doing, that I'm good at, and that I have a purpose for doing.
Yeah. And now this, as much as, there is so much in what you've achieved and in this bio, as I'd say that has almost been a common thread for me, both whether it's amongst my peers, also growing up and throughout my career, and then particularly in the last few years where I've been actually coaching people and hearing their stories and working through their own goals and challenges. And particularly, I've noticed when I'm working with really senior, high achieving professionals who also come from groups who are underrepresented in leadership in their worlds, have this similar story of achievement, tackling multiple things at a time. And it's really got me kind of curious as to why that is. And to your and you've really touched on I guess one of my hypotheses of, well, it's about, a lot of them, if you are underrepresented from an underrepresented group, then you've likely been feeling that sense of, I've got to get this. I'm going to have to work really hard to get there. And then when I have my shot, I better not mess that up thing. And once something like that gets ingrained in you, then to your point, actually, where you think, so many people go for coaching to get more motivation to achieve, you're suddenly having to learn almost the opposite, how to say no, how to put these boundaries in place, how to adopt more of a mindset of going, no, I don't actually have, I'm setting out to achieve things because I'm driven by a sense of purpose, or it's what I want to be doing and it's how I want to be spending my time, over I just have to keep proving myself to others so that I can keep feeling like I am worthy of being in this space. And for you, Bilal, you've got your corporate and legal and finance route, but you have got this threading of politics, of advocacy, the youth support piece. Can you take me through how those have all threaded together for you?
So I think actually they probably don't thread together. And I think that there's a, when we talk about, you look at the CV and you think there's a lot going on there. And, I can, being my own self-critic, I can often see myself as being that plate juggler. And actually what you want to be is a circus performer, a magician, where it's doing all of the things at the right time and they all kind of moving cohesively. Whereas actually what I am doing sometimes is spinning a lot of plates, keeping them all up. But those are 4 or 5 independent, really good things. What I actually should be doing, and that goes to the point earlier of creating those boundaries and thinking more focused about what do I want to be doing, is how do they all kind of splice in or dovetail together? And if they don't, do I start sacrificing one? And I think, in terms of kind of the youth purpose work, a lot of that is because of my own background. I didn't have many opportunities. I didn't have the connections needed. The law in particular, still within the UK, is heavily reliant upon you having family members in the law for you to accede, or for you to come from a middle-class background. And that's invariably people from a white middle-class background. So all of those kind of starters meant systemically I was already behind in terms of doing well. I was very, very lucky in that I found things that empowered me, that allowed me to be seen and for me to get quite lucky in the things that I had done. And for me, the purpose of a lot of it was luck, but it's also kind of happenstance. And I feel that for me, the reason why I have that purpose on youth engagement in particular is that I want to make it easier for people in the future, because fundamentally everybody should have the same chance. And invariably people from disadvantaged backgrounds are as talented to do the work. It's about the access and that empowerment. So that's where the youth comes from. And from that, there's a sense of kind of advocacy comes from it. And then from there, it's a kind of like, well, I should do something to change it. And that comes politics. And actually politics as well. There's within, I think, the South Asian community in the UK, and I think most of the South Asian diaspora, politics, speaking up for what you believe in, actually is entrenched in us, or rather in us quite a lot. It comes from, while my parents weren't necessarily capital P political, they had views and ideas, and they spoke passionately about things. And you grew up with a sense of, particularly within a small community, seeing what was right, seeing what wasn't right, particularly in the 80s and 90s with such extensive, violent, overt racism. All of that kind of creates the context and the melting pot for you to think, well, this is the place I go to. So that explains the politics. But yeah, as I said at the top of this, actually, on the inside, I feel like there's a struggle is balancing more.
Yeah. And I suppose that comes across as, again, there being so many different facets of you wanting to add something in any of those areas. And so it's funny when you sort of keep coming back to describing it as all kind of separate, but the way, when you actually tell the story, it seems really well woven together.
It does. There is a reason why it's the way it is. Otherwise, it's not like it.
Yeah.
It is there, but I think the way I practice it, and I'd also say from the other people in those worlds, they find it a bit disjointed. So, for example, in the frontline politics world, say for the Labour Party, they'll see me as a lawyer, but then the kind of the finance element, and they're like, how does a banking and finance lawyer integrate into the, and it requires, I'm not saying they don't get it, but it requires a conversation and a one step more to kind of translate myself into that world. And equally on the work side, what they see and they're like, this is great. As long as you're not pushing policy, we're very, very happy for you doing what you're doing. But it requires, again, that additional translating conversation. And so it's not just a kind of like, oh, we get this. If you were, for example, if you were a law firm and all you did was close deals and get clients, you don't need to explain that or justify that. And equally with politics, for all you do is live, breathe, and work in the politics world, and then dedicate it to yourself rather than having almost a separate career completely.
Yeah.
Translate. That makes sense. We get that on paper. And it's easier for those. So that's why I think, because the spheres themselves don't necessarily see the kind of narrative as a whole, I have to separate.
Yeah. And I resonate with that on a personal level, because it's this, I think it's the way, maybe it's the way people's brains work, it's our biases. We want to be able to put people in boxes, and then you kind of have to fit color in the gaps.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot I want to unpack there. Firstly, I wanted to start with, from your perspective, how do you sort of reconcile that tension that can exist between being your true self, being really proud of your own heritage and everything that has brought you to where you are, but then that pressure to conform in those corporate and political spaces? So yes, you have to translate it, but how do you embrace and navigate that tension for yourself?
I mean, and look, it's, of all the things I do, I think the one thing is there's a large element of establishment about, my nature of my background and what I do. Personally, I always feel like my politics is a bit more radical than people realize. Okay. But, on the front of it, on the face of me, it looks established. I have that tension. I would say from the corporate side, counterintuitively, I think it's actually easier and getting easier, because ultimately it's about your skills, your ability, rather than your view or your ideology about things. So it's about, you could be a reformist or, a Marxist or whatever. If you're good at your job, you're good at your job largely. And as long as you don't kind of offend people whom you work with and respect their values, then that's fine. And it also is a place that, because it doesn't consume you as a person, it's your job. It allows you the space and the time to do things where you feel like you can make a difference or can represent yourself a bit more. So the best illustration I think I have of that is recently I was invited by the Lord Mayor to set up the City Muslim Network, which would be a professional network for people who identify as Muslim in the London Financial District, which is known as the Square Mile.
Yeah.
And so that's a place for me to build that network up and act as a two-way dialogue between the local city, the City of London, and the Muslim community. So create an open dialogue, allowing us to be seen more formally and in a way that we can interact and have dialogue with the local authority or the municipality. It also allows us to meet each other and to kind of create that, what we call that tornado effect of mentors and networks that rise each other up. That's a good example of me, like, well, that's me being a bit more authentic to who I am and where I'm from, creating it in this space. On the politics side, it's always a tension because there are days that I want to kind of hit the streets, have a placard, tie myself to some railings and kind of like, protest everything, especially these days. And then there's another side of me, which is like, well, actually, I have seen how change is only really possible in the UK, at least, in most circumstances, through the political system and through the establishment of politics. And so there's always a tension there. But look, we grew up of similar ages, and we probably both saw our family members who were deeply political but quite radical. They were taking to the street, particularly fighting for anti-racism at the time in the 80s and the 90s. And also for things like trade workers' rights as well, particularly in factories as well. That kind of stuff. So it's embedded in our DNA to be that kind of like real political radical. And so actually for me, that sits properly. It's about how I project. Is it within the system or is it being a bit more radical about things?
Yeah. And then in terms of that youth work, both with youth, that social mobility kind of side of things, are you seeing a change in thinking with the generations coming through in terms of this? Like my perception is that it's getting easier or younger generations are just better at actually dissipating that tension by just sort of owning the space in a different way, where I felt very, very tied to actually being quite conformist, whatever might have been going on from internally. Is that something you're seeing? And how are you able to foster that in a way that kind of stimulates what they want, and for them being able to be authentic in the way that they rise up?
It's very perceptive of you, actually. So when I was doing, and so by when we mean youth work, what I did was I ran a London debate program, which is essentially a way of mentoring young people with university students, teaching them to debate in competitions. But that was really a medium to be mentoring. So that's the first thing I did about like 15, 20 years ago. What I tend to do now and over my career was young disadvantaged people were doing internships at the places I worked. I would give them speak talks. I would talk them around. I'd be mentored. And what I would say is that what the type of conversation I was having when I first started versus now is radically different. What I was talking about then was seeing people who were generally a bit apprehensive, a bit timid, not owning the space that they were in, telling them that they belong here, giving them a sense of like, you see people like me. When you see people who look like yourself, you feel more comfortable. And that creates a sense of empowerment and therefore nudging them into a sense of belonging. What I see now is different. There is still an element of that, but actually now it's much more entrepreneurial. A lot of people are much more willing to talk about and interested in setting themselves up in their own business, whether it be that or engaging as an influencer or creating something for themselves. And so it's much more now about harnessing or helping. And what I find really interesting at this point is delivering a blueprint. One thing I would say is none of them ever needed to be inspired. We always hear like give an inspiring talk. If they're there in the room, they want it. They've got the ambition. They want to do this. That is not what they need, right? I always sometimes worry that I tend to avoid giving those inspiring speeches because I feel like it would just be a bit patronizing. Like they're there for a reason already. What I want to do is give them a cheat or the hack and the blueprints to be, I did this, don't do that. Instead, do this. And I think now we're in a place that people are much more attuned to that. I do think there's a couple of caveats. The first is post-lockdown and the impact it's had particularly on young people and their ability and comfort within socializing in the wider work has led a lasting effect. And I think actually there's a bit of almost re-going back to things and bringing people out, not because of their background, just because of who they are. So there's that element. And the other element is that the corporate lifestyle is still something that is wanted and attained, but it's much more about channeling ambition rather than bringing it out.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that's a really interesting idea that you channeling the ambition rather than having to actually kind of crank it up to see them being in spaces that we are not used to seeing people of different backgrounds, particularly if we're trying to get them to the top, which is part of that what drives a lot of the stuff that I do to see more of them there. But I'm gonna move in a little bit more squarely into the world of inclusion in the workplace, in the political space, because there's a lot of what you do, whether it's through social mobility, whether it's what you've done and the accolades that you've won for supporting Muslim communities, for supporting disadvantaged youth in London. When I track that back into our workplaces, we will fall into sort of DEI speak in a way that has kind of created these frameworks that are predicated on labels and categories that dictate that you should need this if you are that. And I was keen for your thoughts on this as someone who's led inclusion efforts at a global level and with all the work that you do, both in the political space and the youth social mobility space. Like, how does that sit with you? Our reliance on labels and kind of pushing a framework downwards.
I think the core for us has always been ensuring that the unseen are seen. Right? And that's the purpose and principle. How do we get back from that? And once we see those unseens, how do we cater for them to make them feel included? That's really the name of the game. And I think there was a time, and I think our generation kind of felt that. We felt that labels were a way for us to be easily identifiable. It goes back to the early points of how do you translate that person? How do you explain that person? A label really helped because it meant that somebody who didn't know you could attribute you who you are and see you. So that was the value of what it was. I think as labels have become more prevalent and we're more open to them and they're more reliant, what we risk sometimes doing is making the label the whole be all and end all and the purpose. And we're beyond those labels. It's just a marker, an instruction to be seen. What it is not is the basis by which you determine whether or not people are included or not. We have to remind ourselves of this common purpose and what the purpose of the labels were. They aren't the end all and be all. It is to allow that person to be seen as an authentic self. I think the challenge of the D&I space, now is what we say is getting to the nitty-gritty, is getting to the systemic challenges. Whereas, great that we recognize Ramadan. It's great that we recognize Yom Kippur at workplaces. It's great that places have prayer spaces if they need them. It's great that we have really robust values that will ensure that people are not discriminated within the workplace. But then I think it's now about how do we systemically create work environments where we almost don't need the policies in the first place. The default is that it would never happen. I think that's the real challenge. I've heard some really good illustrations and examples from hiring practices to how our pensions are used and invested, all sorts of things which are much deeper, much more technical, but that's the stuff that is not just performative, not to suggest that the other stuff is performative only, but it is very visible. It's the invisible changes that will impact us. And there's a really good illustration of this I use, which is a bit tangential. So I've got two young kids, they're 6 and 2. The 6-year-old understands that because we practice halal, we'll only eat halal meat. So when we go out, she's now understood whether or not she can or can't eat things or certain sweets she checks in with me. When we've gone to predominantly Muslim countries where everything is halal, she still remembers those trips because she didn't have to think about being different. She was just one and the same. And it's a kind of, it's not the best example in the world, but that's the thing I think about of like people from different backgrounds not having to do that second check between what everybody else has in themselves. That's where we need to get to. And I don't know that labels is the salons.
Yes, I suppose that's a really interesting idea or illustration of where it's kind of when you have the label, and even if you have the benefit that can come from having that label of, okay, we can you can ask for halal meat, we can check it off, and in the same way those would exist in the workplace, that actually the fact that you have to identify yourself with it is also shows that that also indicates this almost lack of inclusion because it's not part and parcel of the system, so to speak. And it's actually a really powerful way of addressing sometimes the problematic nature of labels, because I've found often in that DEI space, once you broach the idea of stripping away those labels or thinking about, well, what are some of the common denominators that we can establish in a community or an environment that goes, actually, this applies to everyone. And therefore, everyone can benefit from it, including the ones that would maybe have to have asked a layer of questions each time. If you can actually find what that base level is, that can benefit you, but then that can risk getting this pushback of, oh, but then if we haven't kept reminding ourselves that labels and a formula and a framework is why we are doing all those things, then what do we have to show for it to say we are ticking these boxes on a metric front?
Yeah.
But maybe it is just, again, maybe it is going to have to be the passage of time and habit and pushing that through. I don't know.
Maybe. Look, a label's not going to change someone's behavior. All it does is get you in the room to be seen and get your voice heard. And then it's about that room being open to change and you being able to have the tools to articulate what that change is. All things are the passage of time. I would say, though, it feels like we've been in an inflection point for the past 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
People are much more willing to talk about this stuff on the forefront of like why this should happen. But equally, people are pushing back and conflating all sorts of issues and pushing back against this agenda. And I think actually now more than ever, it's important to remain robust and kind of stand the ground, because the one risk about passage of time is that's like kind of appeasement or it will eventually happen. I don't know where we'll be in 5 years politically or even in civic society, where people will conflate a push for a more inclusive society with an agenda-based politic and will weaponize what is something with good intention against us. So I do think that there's something to be said of kind of putting the pressure on and being a bit more vocal and building allies wherever we can. And that's the other thing that you mentioned is, compared to 15 years ago, we're much better and aware of the concept of allyship than we were before. It was very much each underrepresented group almost was in a race with each other. And that was actually counterproductive. Whereas now it's much more about unified fronts, helping each other where you can in allyship. And that's a big difference as well.
One of the things in this space that has taken up headspace for me, and I'm interested in your insights on, Bilal, is when we think about, making the unseen seen, one of the things that will come to mind for me is, if we go right back to the beginning of your story and understanding sort of all the friction that existed in your world that you had to sort of keep pushing against to go forward. And you get to where you are now and you want to see representation, you're an advocate and you're actively pushing for, particularly for, for younger people to be able to come up and be who they want to be. Now, I want to insert this word with less of that friction. And I have spoken to other people as well who are really senior and say, I want to be that role. I want to role model this because anyone who's had my similar background or come from a working class background or come from a different cultural heritage, they need to see that it's possible. But if I say, well, if you actually remove some of those barriers to entry, they are a bit more hesitant. And my theory here, and maybe this ties into identity, is, well, if I didn't have to go through all of both the external and internal hurdles to get here, would I actually be here in the first place? And it's sort of to say, well, how do you strike this balance between having like all the things that we need to build resilience, which is a big sort of buzzword amongst this almost a generational divide with like the Gen Z versus the millennial kind of debate. And there is, also this kind of movement to say, well, we've got to take personal responsibility. We can all do our little bit to chip away at, structural barriers, but right here and now, and for your life, it is what it is. So you've got to use what you have to propel yourself forward. So then at a more of an institutional level, how can the legal and financial services industries better support social mobility and that goes beyond sort of those internships and scholarships and the potentially more tokenistic things? What do they need to do to help create the space that you want to see?
So I think it's good to understand that where we are now at present. I think most industries are good at engaging with young people who are graduates or even apprentices or school leavers into convincing them that they are able to apply to their workplace. Mm-hmm. We are good at junior level representation. I think that is more diverse and that's inclusive. I think the struggle that we have and we continue to have is the ascension to the very, very top and leadership. And that comes from a number of places. It comes from a lack of people like you who've paved the way, lack of access, a lack of, one of a better phrase, code speak. When you work in these places, there's a way and a style and an approach to how you think and talk that you may be unaccustomed to, particularly as you ascend. And being quite frank, as you ascend, you need to be a better small p politician rather than just the job that you do. And you don't necessarily get taught that at any university or any school. You just know about it. And that's the kind of thing that I mean. So I think that's the gap that we have is senior leadership. And also, and from that basically is retention. What you have is a lot of very good mid-level management who then start to leave or kind of stay where they are. And that goes to 2 points that I do think we need to raise. One is the ethnicity pay gap, which is to say that if you took a white graduate, an ethnic minority graduate across their career, statistically of what we have in the UK, the white graduate will have benefited more, progressed more in their career than their ethnic minority counterpart, all things being equal. The other one is a class mobility pay gap, which is less data available, where if you took somebody from a working class background versus a middle class background, all things being equal, again, the working class background person over the course of the career will have been less successful than their middle class counterpart. So the answer to both of those things at the starting point is data, legally required data. We have it for the gender pay gap in the UK. To an extent, a lot of big companies do it for the ethnicity pay gap. I think that making it legally mandated for large companies would be a good start. And also to do the same, to ask questions of people from disadvantaged backgrounds, socioeconomic background, for want of a better phrase. That data will then reflect on a much more national scale the problem, once you see and identify the problem, you can point to it. That's the next stage of altering that and causing a mindset to say something must be done about it. On the recruitment from mid-level to leadership, there are a number of easy wins on this, from anonymized CVs to within the United States. There's something called the Rooney Rule, which was one of the NFL coaches implemented a rule whereby if there was a senior role available, at least one of the people who were interviewed, or at least a quarter of the people being interviewed, had to be from minority backgrounds. That's not giving a person a job simply for the color of their skin, but at least getting them in the room.
Interview. Mm-hmm.
I think that's the kind of approach that we now need to take to our recruitment and our retention. And I think that's the kind of stuff that will create the ecosphere of normalizing people who look like you and I in those places of leadership. Once those people in leadership are there, they would then, and it is incumbent upon them, to then make sure that the policies and work practices reflect their background, their understanding, to make sure that they can be their authentic selves. So when more junior people come up the ranks, they can be their more authentic selves. So I think that would be I think my problem is actually leadership and that transit, the elevation point. And the way that it's solved is there's technical things, and the way to show the problem is through data.
Preaching to the choir when it comes to the importance of taking this data-driven approach, understanding where your organization is, not pulling stuff from around us, the zeitgeist, the kind of finger in the air sort of stuff, which in and of itself will expose itself to bias in a way that once you can really break down that data, I see it as such an important starting point. And as is always with these conversations, Bilal, I could go down so many avenues for so much time anywhere. But to close this off, as you know, this podcast is called UNBiased. And we're seeking to address the biases that we have, that we see around us, and try and move beyond them. And for me, when we're trying to move ourselves from judgment to curiosity, I believe that we really must have more questions than answers. And something that my guests are leaving us with at the end of these episodes, Bilal, is: what is a question that you think more people should be asking themselves or others?
I think fundamentally we should ask ourselves, why do we value jobs the way that we do? Why is it that somebody who does my job gets paid X and somebody who does another job, which is arguably better or more important to society, gets paid Y? And I think there's a lot of interesting research and thought and discussion on it, where the basis of kind of Western education comes from the Industrial Revolution, which was to prepare a workforce to work in factories from 9 to 5, rather than creating a community or a society ready and able to contribute and fulfill and be the best version of society as we can. I'm not saying that we're all it's the same educational system as it was in the Victorian era, but that's the basis of it. And so there's a challenge there to say, why is it that a nurse only makes what they do, or a teaching assistant only makes what they do, versus what an investment banker or a lawyer makes? The answer is they contribute more to capital, whereas the first group contributes more to society, arguably, or at least the enrichment of day-to-day society and communities. And I think that there is an opportunity for us, I think particularly with post-lockdown and that kind of entrepreneurial spirit we were talking about earlier. I think there's maybe the moment in time for us to kind of take a step back and say, well, why is this worth that much and that much? Because I think if we radically shift how we reward people for the jobs that they do and their contributions to society in the way that they do, will change the behavior of how we treat each other in society, which is, I think, something that's really quite exciting as a potential.
That is such a thought-provoking question, Bilal. Why do we value jobs in the way that we do today? And it's such the essence of, I think, when you want change, to start questioning why things are the way they are in the first place. So Bilal, thank you so much for taking time out to chat to us today. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. I derive so much energy from speaking to such inspiring guests and having really meaningful and challenging conversations. If you felt the same way, my ask of you is to please subscribe to this podcast, either here or wherever you download your podcast content from. Unbiased is a labour of love for me, and the impact that these perspectives have depend on reaching as many eyes and ears as possible. So your support is invaluable. Until next time, stay curious.